Welcome to Come to Think of It, a program where we talk about things that matter. I'm Casey Scott, your host, and today we're talking about the nature of addiction, once again with Roget Lockard. Roget, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Casey.
Now, when we concluded our last conversation, we were talking, oddly enough, about football and how the sport has changed over the years and become more violent and more let's say gaudier, for want of a better
sensational.
word. Yeah, more sensational. And we mentioned a backlash currently to that, and I got curious about that, and I Googled the phrase "why I stopped watching football." And I was astounded to get 20,300,000 results from that query.
Give or take 3 dozen.
Yeah. Well, it said about. And the first page was articles from the likes of the Boston Globe, Forbes, the New Yorker, Time, Dallas Morning News, and I was just astonished. And I didn't read all of these articles, but I scanned them, and I didn't go any more depth than just to pick some from this first page. But what struck me was that these writers were not talking about, well, they were talking about the injuries and the behavior of football players off the field, but basically the thrust of these articles was that they stopped watching football because of the moral effect that it was having on them. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really very, very interesting. There was one here. Let's see, where is this? Oh, here it is. This is from The Atlantic. It's been 2 years since I parted ways with the NFL and opened up my Sundays to other things. At the time, I thought of it as a personal boycott. In other words, you don't stop watching pro football with the intent of igniting a movement or of effecting one whit of change in the NFL. You do it so that you can sleep at night, so that you can preserve your own morality. I left to keep my side of the street clean in the particular way that I like. I thought that was a very profound sort of illustration of the kind of consciousness of sobriety that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a really fascinating discovery that you made there, and I wonder actually if it's virtually your discovery, putting those pieces together. The idea of tabulating the people who come under the purview of that.
Well, if I'm done it, I'm sure there are many thousands of other people who have done it.
Maybe, but in any case, it's really worthwhile for a cluster of reasons in terms of our conversation. One of which I think serves our purpose in this conversation today very richly. And that is, we have started to venture into the idea of addiction and sobriety on systemic levels. Mm-hmm. And I think we touched on the idea of the systems being made up of subsystems, such as people, mm-hmm. And people being made up of subsystems, such as organs and cells and so forth. But so when we want to take that model and make it a little more pithy and graspable, mm-hmm. We can see, well, what happens if we try to apply it to some of the sort of foundational propositions in the way we've been talking about addiction, one key piece of which being, what is the event called hitting bottom? What does it consist of? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How does it play out? And as I'm sure you recall, I have found 3 different definitions of hitting bottom as very useful. But I have a favorite child, and it happens to be the third one in order of development, and it's the one that says, hitting bottom is when you're no longer willing to live with the person you've become. But one of the key pieces in terms of the observation that you made, and the discovery you made, is that this trend or this emerging dismay, or whatever we want to call it, is happening simultaneous with absolute record blockbusting statistics in terms of the popularity of viewership. The Monday Night Football add-on turns out not enough. Now we have Thursday night added on, and you can't, beat the advertisers away with a stick. The ratings are so high. So isn't it interesting that we can have these simultaneously, people just like ravenously saying, I want more, and not just I want more quantity, I want more sensationalism, more scandal. I confess to occasionally venturing into the world of talk radio on the sports channels, and they seem to kind of have a contest as to who can sort of sensationalize / trivialize the other. It becomes so much about personalities and so forth. Anyway, I don't want to get too far afield, except to say that I don't want to get too far afield at all. But I want to say that this parallels what goes on inside the experience of the individual addict.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's say an alcoholic who fairly early in the game starts to have experiences where they feel, they notice, this isn't right, this isn't who I want to be, this isn't how I want to be. I'll need to look into that soon. And over time, those what's the word? Things not lining up.
Discord.
Discord, incongruencies between who I want to be, who I think of myself, what I truly believe in, what my conscience points me to, blah blah blah, and my actual experienced behavior become increasingly wide. And that's crazy making and despair inducing and so forth.
It definitely is, yes.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, one of the pieces of that collection that you shared with me while we were off camera had to do with a gentleman who said something like, "I'm going on an NFL fast, just for 2 days, mind you."
Right. Yes.
And
he went on at some length about what an uplifting experience it was.
Right, but no way. And I can personally remember, having those kinds of experiences with my drinking where, it was very good for me to take the weekend off or the week off or the day off or the afternoon off.
He did say in the article the next week, I'm going to be right back on the couch.
Well, exactly. So the idea of doing, excuse me, of doing without, is literally not so much unthinkable as intolerable to think about. So in any case, the bottom line is we are living in a culture where those kinds of divergences, diffractions of what part of us craves and yearns for and invests in, worships and so forth, and another part of us becomes increasingly ill at ease, and we have to do all the different things that we do when we have these kinds of things, denial and minimalism being.
And at all levels of society,
right.
From the individual to the family to the
corporations,
right.
Political bodies,
nation states. We were talking. We had a conversation off camera about the price of gasoline.
Well, that's all right. I thought that's where you're going.
Wonderful illustration of that.
Right, and it was prompted, you recall, by my observing at this particular time that we're being filmed, On the way up here to the studio, I passed a filling station that had something that I would have wagered a few $100s we would never see again. And that was the price of a gallon gas being under $3. Mm-hmm. Granted, by 1/10 of 1 cent. but
under $3.
I never expected to see a 2 in that spot. And the relevance of that here, I mean, in addition to the fact that it invites me once again to be humble about my prognostication powers, but I think much more urgently of relevance is the fact that that's such the wrong direction for the price of gas to be going in terms of addressing the concerns of global change, of climate change, which has now become a very commonplace truism, is the compelling issue of certainly our time, this century, and my own perspective is of our species. Mm-hmm. In evolutionary terms, on the most fundamental, will we survive as a species or not? And every addiction, as we've talked about before, if it's going to resolve and make the profound transformation into sobriety, is founded on an essential an essential no. Mm. Where there's something that we say no to, be it a simple behavioral thing, I want to put simple in quotes, mm-hmm. Apparently simple behavioral thing, like not drinking, like not using so much gasoline, or more complex things, again, as we've talked about, like with food and personal relations and so forth. But there's some underlying thing that constitutes abstinence. Mm-hmm. There's a discipline involved, and there's much else, as we know. We went through all the 12 steps and so forth. So how is that promoted? How might that come about? How might that evolve in the consciousness of our society, of our culture, of our species? I don't really know of any more compelling questions for us to be observing. But that discrepancy, that dichotomy, while it's disturbing and distressing, is probably not merely inevitable, but probably necessary. Because I know that for myself, hitting bottom had to become an experience of being torn unbearably in opposite directions. My addiction was pulling in this direction, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And the being in me that tried to have some degree of self-respect.
You did speak in an earlier program about taking a drink against your will.
Right.
And
exactly.
Which is a perfect example
right.
of that.
And that was, excuse me, that was the second to last day of drinking for me. So that's an indication of how acute things had become. And so I guess part of what I'm getting at here is that the severity of some of the things that we're seeing, whether it's on the cultural levels of the sports, and we have just touched it.
Oh,
I mean, the video games are, don't get me started.
Well, we did talk about video games earlier on, too.
Enough for my needs at this point. I have 5 grandchildren and 2 more on the way. But where was I headed with that?
Well, I think there are.
Excuse me.
Yes, go ahead.
I know that that severe discrepancy, which is so painful to observe and experience, is also necessary.
Right.
And so, if we can develop enough what I like to call addictions literacy, to understand that this is what needs to happen in order for us, just like certain disease processes need to go through a cycle of severity and arrive at a certain crisis, hopefully a manageable crisis, and then move into states of health. We have to go through hitting bottom. We have to go through disenchantment with the old states of consciousness, with the old belief systems, epistemologies that are, again, foundational, and until and there are no possible alternatives until suddenly there are.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have to go through that individually. We have to go through that as a society.
Exactly.
We have to go through that as a species.
Exactly.
That's a tall order, and we can't accomplish that. We can only do it for ourselves.
A couple other people.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about the gasoline is, I fully agree that is exactly the wrong direction that the price of gasoline should go in, and there are very good, very sound economic, systemic reasons why the price of gasoline is going down at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But it should logically be going in the other direction in order to have us all participate in a healthier planet. On the other hand, if I saw that gasoline under $3, you can bet I'd be looking at the needle to see whether or not I could buy some of that.
But that's okay, unless you translate buying it less expensively as a license to use it more freely, which, frankly, I don't particularly expect you're likely to do. I suspect your driving habits are going to be your driving habits, whether it's $2 a gallon or $4 a gallon. No,
you're absolutely right. But the other side of that is more internal and more personal, and that is that when I see that and I can buy the cheapest gasoline in town or the cheapest gasoline in 3 counties, I get a hit from that because I feel like I'm getting away with something, and that's where my addictions really want to go. Is I'm getting away with something.
Yep. An important difference is you were referring earlier in those remarks to the systemic ways that account for the price of gasoline now and indeed all the time, and basically, let's take as an example a carbon tax, which has been talked about for a long time. Widely is, I know, used in some countries. I think it's fairly extensive in Europe. And that's very analogous to the addict saying no. Here I have market forces left to their own devices will provide me with cheap gas, but I'm going to intervene based on consciousness of the ways in which that is, it takes me down a path of willfulness that redounds to my own destruction, dismay. And so I'm going to say no and impose a tax on myself.
Well, that's exactly, we're taping here about 2 weeks in advance of the upcoming elections, and there is a question on the Massachusetts ballot that will directly influence the price of gasoline one way or the other, depending on how the vote goes. It'll be very interesting to see how that works. Whether or not the state of consciousness in this state is more like, I want the best for me, I'm going to take what I can get, or I want the best for society and for the planet.
Well, and there's that whole thing we've talked off and on, that so much of what happens is not like when I was drinking, the last years that I was drinking, I didn't do a calculation that said, let's see, I want the best for me, so I'm going to drink a quart of vodka. That wasn't what was happening.
Right.
And I think I told you about the conversation I had very recently with a wonderful young man who is, first of all, he's sober and thoughtfully sober, conscientiously sober. And he's buying a new house and with a big yard, and he's contemplating what kind of mower to get. I tossed out the idea of a real, he's a young, robust young guy, of a real mower, the kind.
Sure, the kind that turns with the wheels.
Manpower, right.
Right, yeah.
Or woman power. Kid power when I grew up.
Yeah, exactly so, yes, I remember that.
and he sort of chuckled at that, but it clearly didn't enter in. But he was talking about, a walk-behind mower. But then there's the walk-behind mower that has a seat, and happily he was not making fun of, but observing and appreciating, and at the same time sympathizing with the process that he experienced, whereby he went from the $300 walk-behind mower, power mower, to the $15,000 riding mower that had all the bells and whistles you can imagine, including takeoff gear.
Yeah.
And it was the thrill of agency. Is for me, that's the bottom line. It's like I can make it happen. I know the feeling. I shared with you the confession of watching myself, who, as you know, I'm pretty passionate about the global warming thing and so forth. Okay, so I go out to our deck, and there's a broom and there's a blower, electric blower that I plug in that uses fossil fuels. And more often than not, I use that blower. Oh, it's a small deck. Yes, Roget. Okay. and I watch myself get off on just like the gesture. I just gesture around, and they all disappear.
Right.
Whereas with the broom, I have to. P.S. Before the invention of brooms, like the broom was like a marvelous.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that sense of agency that you talk about reminds me of a document that you wrote. Actually, this is a chapter from your unfinished book called. This chapter is called "America's Fireworks," and it talks about basically it's kind of a synopsis of the cultural history of the United States, beginning with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Well, let me interject there.
Yes.
The essential point of that chapter, that section of the book, is to identify what I see as kind of the quintessential moment of intoxication in American culture. Go ahead.
And that's where you put that moment.
The preeminent one that got us in the fix we're in, as I've mentioned to you before, you can punctuate that all the way back 12,000 years to the beginning of the long summer, and legitimately, because that's when we started getting off on agency and being in charge. And before that, we were, wandering around looking for food.
But up until 2001, the United States had agency in abundance, and that's certainly been challenged on the global stage tremendously since then.
But here, where we start with, as you know, and I'm sure you're headed for, is I think the moment that was just nailed it, and that was the dropping of the atomic bombs. Right.
And it was an amazing technological achievement. And it was an amazing military achievement, but at what horrendous cost. And not only the cost to the Japanese people, but the cost to America, and how that set us on this course of being, as you say at one point, the champions of the world. And not the champions of the world in the sense of advocates for the world, but the masters of the world. And we've seen ourselves that way for the last, I'd say for the last half of the 20th century.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, from World War II on. And again, there's a part of me that wants to get indignant and scold us retrospectively for that. And God knows in the past I've invested in that fairly generously. But as I mentioned earlier, I suspect that those developments are not merely inevitable, but necessary. That is to say, you're familiar with my observation that addiction is a likely outcome of the intersection of human nature and technology, in that broad sense of the word technology.
Technology meaning a means of
any
agency.
means of manipulating, in this case, in particular, our existential experience. And we are challenged in an evolutionary sense, in a psychological sense, in cultural sense, and the various philosophies and systems within a civilization like economics and so forth. But ultimately, to come to terms with the enticement of ever expanding agency and arrive at the place where we say no as a celebration. Because that's the nature of no for the conventional addict, the alcoholic, the drug addict, whatever it may be, is that their saying no is no longer this ghastly, unimaginable, and intolerable option.
Which it starts out to be.
Which, well, yeah.
Yeah.
I suspect you've heard that that shift from I can't drink to I can not drink.
Right. And but the celebration is, I'm reminded of Louis Armstrong, what a wonderful world.
Yeah.
And with that, Roget, I'm afraid we're out of time again. But thank you so much.
My pleasure.
You'll be back again.
Look forward to it.
Thank you for joining us on Come to Think of It. I hope you'll be with us next time. Until then, drive cheerfully. I'm Casey Scott.